The random events didn't take place cause of somebody's intention or desire. It was a result of numerous events that built upon one another in a series of chain reactions. The vast majority of those chains went nowhere at all, some of them eventually lead to life. Given the right circumstances of temperature and pressure as well as a conductive medium, various chemicals will bind and break and mix to form several of the key ingredients for life. Some places on Earth were too hot, some too cold. Some were just right, but volcanic activity destroyed the reaction before it could fully develop. Eventually, in one or more places, the right environment existed for the right length of time to create something similar to but not exactly like what we call life. This was likely a few strains of complex protein chains that repeatedly formed and broke over and over again in a soup of material exposed to environmental stresses. Eventually, some of those protein chains bound together stronger than others and became dominant. As certain groupings of chemical chains developed in parallel, they began to react with each other as well as the environmental concerns. At this point, nothing existed that could be called life as we know it. What we had were reactions that, given the right exposure to light and geothermic heat and environmental cooling, would react with each other. Each time they reacted, new compounds could and would be created, and some of these compounds could then create yet more compounds. As the reactions became more complex, some of them found the natural limit of how many things they could react with, others had almost limitless reactions. Amino acids could bind and mix into proteins of ever-increasing complexity. Other chemicals could only become so complex before the reaction would stop and neutralize or stabilize and become non-reactive. Eventually, certain compounds were created that would self-propagate and go through a cycle of creation, growth, and then division, and eventually break down. The difference is these new reactions could grow like how crystals or ice grow, but unlike crystals and ice, they were growing copies of complex chains of protein. What is more, they would create copies of themselves many times before dividing and each piece growing again. This was still not life as we know it, but was infinitesimally close. These chemical reactions could grow and divide, and then each piece could then repeat the process, but they did such as a simple chemical reaction. They were almost mechanical. Eventually, some of these complex chains of chemicals became so complex that some parts of the structure would react differently to different stimuli. The stimuli could be binding to certain chemicals, or it could be reacting a certain way to light. These stimuli would trigger other complex chemical reactions inside the structure, which might in turn influence yet other reactions going on in response to other stimuli. This is the point that we had the most basic and simple form of life. It was less complex than even modern microbes like viruses and bacteria, but it had all of the basic elements of life: birth, replications, reaction to stimuli, and death. These amino acids and the resulting proteins and other chemical chains they create are so amazing that they can bind in ever-growing, ever-lengthening complex webs of chemicals. Some of these chemicals were easier to form and others were not. Some replicated better, others did not. Some replicated better in one environment, others in another. Some began to produce a chemical reaction in response to stimuli that served a useful purpose, such as locomotion. Reactions that did not serve a useful purpose or make that particular structure better able to replicate would be drowned out by other chemical reactions that had more functional reactions. This process continued on and on over hundreds of millions of years until the first single-celled life was formed, which led to multicellular life. This was going on all over the world in different pockets. Some never made it this far due to the strains and environment of a young planet being so very turbulent and violent. Other areas just were not exposed to as much harmful influence and allowed life to grow and flourish. We can take a single cell from our own body and watch as the same chemical processes I described allow it to go through its life cycle while we watch. In this case, a white blood cell chases down a tiny bacteria. The white blood cell, one of the most complex units of life, chasing one of the simplest. Every single movement and action of the cell can be broken down into a series of chemical reactions, from the way the white blood cell moves to how it detects and engulfs the bacteria. White blood cell chases bacteria, it is all chemistry and reactions. All the way from the food you eat and medicines you take to those crazy white blood cells hunting down bacteria in your body. As amazing as this process is, it can all be broken down as simple chemical reactions that interact with each other in an elegant dance that requires no mysticism nor gods or magic to produce. Just chemistry. Your cells would do this all on their own, no help needed, just as the simple-celled organisms did before man or the proto-life before that. DNA replication. This may seem amazingly complex, but the fact is this is the end stage of a process of chemical and biological development that has been going on for billions of years. It did not start out this complex, but each iteration added complexity to the process. First proto-life, then simple life, then single-celled life, then multicellular life and complex organisms. So no life was not just a magical event that suddenly birthed life. Not by a god and not by pure randomness either. It was a process of tiny steps, like the carving of a canyon. Each step leading the way for yet more complex steps in a continuous chain of events. Some chains and events went nowhere, some lead to modern life. The successful and lucky ones are still here today. Considering how many stars are out there that we know could never support life on any of their worlds, and the vast numbers of galaxies that span the entire universe, it is far more likely that we are a natural reaction. The alternative is that our own rather small and ordinary galaxy has 100,000 million stars, and only a tiniest fraction of them could ever support life in even one of their planets. If we extrapolate from that, then there are over 1024 stars in our observable universe, and possibly more than that. That is 1 septillion stars. That many stars, and only the tiniest fraction of them have even one planet that might be capable of supporting life. The alternative of there being a creator is that he made 1 septillion stars before figuring out how to get it right and make Sol and Earth. It is beyond all definition of hubris to think that all of that was created just for us. Even if there was a creator, whatever created him must have been an even more elaborate and incredibly unlikely process than the process that created us. This alone makes the concept of a creator less likely. Let's save a step and base our findings on what we can test and observe, not on myth and fantasy. Every religion has its own version of how things came to be, and most of them conflict with each other. Why, if any one God existed, did all of the other religions not die out? Why were religions that predated the current religions not able to remain around? Why do the rules and laws of religions change over time? Why have gods never shown themselves openly to everyone? Belief in religion requires far more assumptions and faith than science does. In fact, science doesn't need faith but evidences. Science is testable, objective, observable, rational and repeatable. Religions are always in conflict and subjective, individual, irrational and cannot be tested. I will stick to trusting science, and hence an atheist.
We are going to die, and that makes us the lucky ones. Most people are never going to die because they are never going to be born. The potential people who could have been here in my place but who will in fact never see the light of day outnumber the sand grains of Arabia. Certainly those unborn ghosts include greater poets than Keats, scientists greater than Newton. We know this because the set of possible people allowed by our DNA so massively exceeds the set of actual people. In the teeth of these stupefying odds, it is you and I, in our ordinariness, that are here. We privileged few, who won the lottery of birth against all odds. How dare we whine at our inevitable return to that prior state from which the vast majority have never stirred? Richard Dawkins.